So, curving away from all the loot box and Metal Gear Survive talks as of late, instead of pointing out how utterly ridiculous all of that is, I'm here to talk about something on the other side of the spectrum. The last couple of years I've been playing more and more Japanese RPGs, or games that come close to that specification, and with every single one that was good, the more I realized why I was so drawn into them in comparison to, say, another genre. And that's not to say that there aren't boring JRPGs, no, there are, of course. But when you have this format of a sort of long adventure, you as the player develop more of an attachment and relatability a lot more easily. How even some games that are less than stellar, you'd probably be more inclined to get invested into them. Whether it's your Tales of, or Final Fantasies, or even Personas, of course. And even going into more obscure territory with the likes of, let's say, Blue Dragon, which I only discovered not long ago, and I've still yet to complete it, just throwing that out there. And they all share the same main formula. One thing's for sure, you can't go corporate with this genre, at least so far it hasn't happened. Now, by corporate I obviously mean the, dare I say it, loot box shenanigans. Honestly, every time I see people talk about it on YouTube now, I can just imagine them foaming about it, but you know what I mean. But that's not the point here. It might seem obvious, but it goes deeper than that. I mean, when you have grinding in your JRPG, it's completely fine, but when it's in another genre, it's suddenly very unacceptable. Or if your gameplay loop is based around something like that. But the loop that JRPGs have make you want to return to it. They remind you, or at least me, of what a game can truly do. Granted, my favorite game series aren't in this genre, but that might as well change in the future, especially seeing as how the titles I'm most looking forward to are JRPGs, or at least Japanese by nature. The repetition that these games can have is usually more acceptable because of how it balances out the mundane, and typically most plots revolve around a group of characters with special abilities, or they're normal in that fictional world that they come from. But it's exactly that balance that can make a fictional work stand out. It's deemed as different despite the formula usually being the same, as I have mentioned. Why else would I have gotten the most emotional with some of these titles? I mean, some years back I didn't even think I'd be getting into them like this. Some of these titles also succeed in being more of an experience than actual experience games, meaning if you have a 5-hour story-driven game, it might pale in comparison to a 50-hour one, because of how the gameplay and story are folded together. Now, I'm not saying you won't get tired of such a long game before it's over, but if it's done right, there's nothing else like it out there. It's like your favorite TV series ending after a few dozen seasons, and you might grow a lot more attached than you would with like one season. Now, obviously none of this is one-sided. I mean, some of my favorite games aren't nowhere near that long, and a tight experience can definitely be better than a bloated one. But if you're making a JRPG, you're already putting a staple on it that it's gonna be a long journey, and if it's a good one, then you're gonna enjoy that entire loop more than you would with a short game. And I think, or at least hope, that more and more genres can realize this loop and start taking advantage of it. I mean, shooters, for example. I can picture a bunch of them with a story and a world akin to Prey, for example. And yes, it's not a JRPG, and yes, that might sound silly, but there has to be a point of progress, world building, and this is it in my opinion. Certain indie titles have found a way around being very short, roguelikes and procedural generation, for example. But the way you build that comes with progression, and JRPGs usually have more progression than out of anything else. When you have a standard shooter, you typically don't progress in the game outside of set pieces and story, as well as gameplay mechanics, but in Prey, as I briefly mentioned, you're constantly being rewarded, but not overly rewarded. You're presented with numerous skill trees and styles that you can use, whereas a cover shooter is usually, well, based around map strategy. And I think the whole reason Battle Royale has escalated to the point it has is because of its presented gameplay choices. I remember back in the GTA 4 days where the online free roam was practically that. given that you have friendly fire enabled, because you could customize your lobby options. It was always fun to go back in and build up all your shit, so to speak, and then do it over and over again to see for how long you can hold out. The premise of this in even online shooters is usually kill streaks and death ratios, but my main point here is obviously about single player. Make more non-linear games but tight and focused stories. If you've noticed, this genre has been expanding, including other non-JRPG series like Yakuza, and the sales are also increasing in the West. So I think the next step is to incorporate this formula into other genres and find a way to creatively work around the budget that any team might have. Because appealing to both sides usually doesn't work. And to those with a budget, well, if you're gonna milk something, at least do it with style. What I mean by that is that you can play both sides. Let's say certain big IPs or certain MMOs don't really get slandered for microtransactions because of the way they mask it. And the same has been done with recent games, but for some reason they still get called out. I'll give you Deus Ex as an example. Mankind Divided had microtransactions, but it really didn't matter, like, at all. The game itself wasn't affected, they were an afterthought. Not part of the game design, but people acted otherwise. And the same thing can happen with Japanese games in the future, so I wonder if at that point people will realize it's all situational. Something having a feature or name slapped on doesn't automatically mean it's bad and the end of it all. But now I have digressed, so let's stop here. And for the love of fucking anything, stop talking about loot boxes.